The mahogany-paneled boardroom of Morrison Industries overlooked Manhattan's bustling financial district, where autumn leaves danced against floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard Morrison, 67, sat at the head of the polished conference table, his weathered hands folded as he studied the faces around him. Despite building a $3.2 billion empire from a single construction company, Richard had learned that wealth often revealed people's true nature, and rarely in flattering ways. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, his longtime physician and trusted friend, sat beside him with a manila folder containing fabricated medical reports. They had spent weeks crafting this elaborate deception, inspired by Richard's recent study of King Solomon's wisdom in discerning truth from lies. "The tests are conclusive," Dr. Hendricks announced gravely to the assembled family members and executives. "Richard has been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition. He has perhaps 6 months, maybe less." Richard watched carefully as shock registered across familiar faces. His eldest son, Marcus, 42, immediately pulled out his phone, likely calculating inheritance taxes, Richard mused. His daughter, Sarah, 38, dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though Richard noticed her glancing toward the window where her new Bentley waited in the parking garage below. His younger brother, Tom, who had never worked a day at Morrison Industries but lived comfortably off Richard's generosity, simply stared at the table. "Dad, we need to discuss the succession plan," Marcus said, his voice barely concealing eagerness. "The board needs stability during this transition." Richard's personal assistant, Elena Martinez, a 45-year-old single mother who had worked for him for 15 years, quietly refilled his water glass. Her hands trembled slightly, the only person in the room showing genuine distress. "There's time for that," Richard replied calmly, remembering Solomon's words about the patient man who shows great understanding. "I want to spend these months observing, learning what truly matters." Over the following days, the news spread through their social circles like wildfire. Richard established himself in his penthouse apartment, claiming the office environment was too stressful for his condition. From this vantage point, he began his carefully orchestrated test. He instructed Elena to inform everyone that he was reviewing his will and considering significant changes. Like Solomon placing a baby between 2 women claiming to be its mother, Richard would discover who truly cared for his well-being versus his wealth. The first visitors arrived within hours. Marcus appeared with legal documents and a detailed business restructuring plan. "Dad, I've been thinking about the company's future. We should transfer key assets into a family trust immediately, for tax purposes, of course." Sarah brought expensive flowers and stayed exactly 23 minutes. Richard timed it. She spent most of the visit discussing her upcoming charity gala, subtly mentioning the substantial donation she hoped the Morrison Foundation would make. Brother Tom arrived with a bottle of Richard's favorite whiskey and a proposal for a new investment opportunity that, coincidentally, required immediate funding. But Elena simply brought homemade soup and sat quietly, asking how he felt and whether he needed anything. She didn't mention money, inheritance, or business, only his comfort and peace of mind. As the first week concluded, Richard sat in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books on philosophy and wisdom traditions. He opened his journal and wrote, "Day 7 of the test. Like Solomon, I'm beginning to see the hearts of those around me. The question isn't who wants my fortune, it's who truly loves the man behind it." The golden hour light filtered through his apartment windows as Richard contemplated the path ahead. 6 more months of observation would reveal everything he needed to know. The test had begun, and already the results were both predictable and heartbreaking. 2 weeks into Richard's fabricated illness, Morrison Industries headquarters buzzed with whispered conversations and suspicious glances. The morning rain pelted against the windows of the 45th floor executive suite, where Marcus Morrison called an emergency family meeting. "We need to discuss Dad's mental state," Marcus announced to Sarah and Uncle Tom, his voice carrying the authority he believed he deserved as the eldest son. Yesterday, he gave Elena a $50,000 bonus for her years of service. That's not normal behavior. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, designer handbag clutched tightly. "He's also been asking strange questions about our childhood memories, our dreams, what we'd do if money weren't a factor. It's unsettling." Tom nodded gravely, though his motivations were transparently self-serving. "I'm concerned about his judgment. Perhaps we should consider a competency evaluation." What they didn't know was that Elena had discreetly installed a recording system in the conference room at Richard's request, perfectly legal in New York with single-party consent. As Richard was technically present through the building's intercom system he could access from his penthouse. Meanwhile, across town, Richard sat in his study, listening to their conversation through a secure connection. Dr. Hendricks sat beside him, shaking her head in disbelief. "Your own children are discussing having you declared incompetent," she whispered. "Richard, are you sure you want to continue this charade?" Richard's weathered face remained stoic, but his eyes betrayed deep sadness. Solomon's greatest wisdom was recognizing that truth emerges under pressure. "I'm applying that pressure now." That afternoon, Richard received a parade of visitors, each with increasingly transparent agendas. His country club friends arrived with investment opportunities. His brother-in-law presented a can't-miss real estate deal in Florida. Even his barber showed up with a business plan for a chain of luxury salons. But it was Elena's behavior that truly captured Richard's attention. While others schemed, she had quietly taken over many of his personal responsibilities without being asked. She coordinated his medical appointments, managed his household staff, and even learned to prepare his medications, all while maintaining her regular duties and caring for her teenage son. One evening, as autumn rain drummed against the penthouse windows, Eleanor knocked softly on Richard's study door. "Mr. Morrison, I've finished organizing your correspondence. Is there anything else you need before I head home to help Miguel with his college applications?" Richard looked up from his book, a biography of King Solomon. "Elena, sit for a moment. Tell me about Miguel's plans." She settled into the chair across from his desk, her tired eyes lighting up. "He wants to study engineering like you did. Says you inspired him during that career day presentation you gave at his high school 3 years ago." Richard remembered that day, one of the few times someone had asked him to speak about his journey rather than write a check. "And how are you managing the application fees, the preparation costs?" Elena's smile faltered slightly. "We'll figure it out. Miguel's working part-time at the grocery store, and I've picked up some weekend bookkeeping for small businesses. We don't expect charity, Mr. Morrison. You've already done so much by giving me steady employment and health insurance." The contrast was stark. While his own family plotted to access his wealth immediately, Eleanor worked multiple jobs to provide for her son's future, without asking for a penny beyond her earned salary. That night, Richard made his first journal entry about the deeper test emerging. "It's not enough to identify who wants my money versus who cares about my well-being. I must discover who embodies the values I want to see continue in the world: integrity, hard work, genuine care for others." The next morning brought unexpected news. Marcus had retained a high-profile attorney, specializing in estate planning and elder law. Sarah had made appointments with 3 different financial planning firms. Tom had approached 2 different banks about bridge loans using his expected inheritance as collateral. But Elena had done something entirely different. She had researched his supposed medical condition extensively, compiling a folder of treatment options, specialists, and experimental therapies. She left it on his desk with a simple note: "Mr. Morrison, I thought this information might be helpful. I highlighted the most promising options. Please don't give up hope." As Richard read through Elena's meticulously researched document, he realized that Solomon's wisdom wasn't just about clever tests. It was about recognizing the rare individuals who, when faced with others' suffering, respond with love rather than opportunism. The test was revealing exactly what he had hoped and feared it would. Now came the harder question. What would he do with this knowledge? 3 weeks into his elaborate deception, Richard Morrison discovered that his test was yielding an unexpected complication: genuine guilt. As he sat in his leather armchair watching Eleanor research treatment options for his fabricated illness, he began to question whether Solomon's wisdom justified causing real emotional pain to an innocent person. The morning sun streamed through his penthouse windows as Elena arrived with her usual punctuality, carrying not just his preferred coffee, but also a small potted plant. "It's a peace lily," she explained, setting it near the window. "My grandmother always said they purify the air and bring healing energy to a room. I thought, well, I hoped it might help somehow." Richard felt a pang of conscience watching her tender care. This woman, earning a modest salary while supporting her son's college dreams, had spent her own money on a gesture of hope for his fabricated condition. Meanwhile, the vultures circled with increasing boldness. Marcus had begun arriving at the penthouse with boxes of documents, spreading papers across Richard's dining room table, like a general planning a campaign. "Dad, I've restructured the entire corporate hierarchy," Marcus announced during one visit, his expensive suit impeccable despite the early hour. "We need to transfer operational control before your condition worsens. The board is getting nervous about market stability." Richard observed his son's calculated movements, noting how Marcus never asked about pain levels, treatment options, or emotional needs, only business continuity and asset protection. Sarah's approach was more subtle but equally transparent. She had begun hosting intimate family dinners at her estate in the Hamptons, inviting influential friends who happened to be estate attorneys, tax specialists, and wealth management experts. "We're just trying to prepare for every possibility," she explained during one of her brief visits, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her phone screen as she simultaneously managed her social calendar. It's what responsible families do. But it was Tom's behavior that provided the most egregious example of opportunism. Richard's brother had started making promises to creditors and business associates, using his anticipated inheritance as collateral for increasingly risky ventures. Dr. Hendricks brought concerning news during one of their private meetings. "Tom has been telling people at the country club that he'll be handling your medical decisions if you become incapacitated. He's even suggested that you've already promised him control of your art collection." Richard's art collection, valued at over $200 million, included pieces he had carefully acquired over decades, each one connected to a memory, a milestone, or a moment of beauty that had touched his soul. "The collection goes to the Metropolitan Museum," Richard stated firmly. "It always has. That's been in my will for 10 years. "Tom doesn't seem to know that," Dr. Hendricks replied. "Or he's choosing to ignore it." That evening, Richard made a decision that would accelerate his timeline. He called Elena into his study, where she found him apparently struggling with medication bottles. "Elena, I need to ask you something difficult," he began, his voice carefully modulated to sound weaker than usual. "If something happens to me, if my condition deteriorates quickly, I want you to promise me something." Elena immediately moved closer, her expression full of concern. "Of course, Mr. Morrison, anything. I want you to make sure my wishes are honored. Not what others claim I wanted, but what's actually written in my legal documents. Can you do that?" The weight of responsibility settled on Elena's shoulders, but she nodded without hesitation. "I promise, but let's focus on treatments, on fighting this. Don't talk about giving up." Richard felt another stab of guilt at her genuine anguish, but he pressed forward. "There's something else. I've been thinking about legacy, about what really matters. If you could change anything about the world, what would it be?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Education," she answered without hesitation. "Every child deserves the opportunity to learn, to grow, to reach their potential regardless of their family's financial situation. That's why I work so hard for Miguel's college fund. Not just for him, but because education lifts entire communities." Her answer resonated with Richard's own values. Formed during his childhood in a working-class family, where education had been his escape route to success. Over the following days, Richard began documenting everything in his private journal. Marcus's increasing demands for power, Sarah's superficial concern masking financial calculations, Tom's outright lies about promised inheritances, and Elena's consistent demonstration of integrity, compassion, and wisdom. But he also began planning the next phase of his test. It was time to see how each person would react when faced with what appeared to be his final wishes, and whether anyone would choose his well-being over their own interests. The journal entry that night read, "Solomon's wisdom teaches that the heart of the matter lies not in what people say, but in what they do when they believe no one is watching. Tomorrow I raise the stakes." A month into his deception, Richard Morrison orchestrated the most crucial phase of his test. The late November sky hung heavy over Manhattan, matching the somber mood he had carefully cultivated in his penthouse. Dr. Hendricks arrived that morning with updated medical reports showing his condition had allegedly worsened. "It's time," Richard told her quietly. "I want to see who will honor a dying man's wishes versus who will pursue their own agenda." That afternoon, Richard called each family member separately, requesting individual meetings to discuss his final arrangements. The conversations would reveal everything he needed to know about their true characters. Marcus arrived first, armed with his usual briefcase and confident demeanor. Richard, appearing frail and wrapped in a cashmere blanket, spoke in deliberately weakened tones. "Son, I want to discuss something important. I've been thinking about the company's future, and I believe Elena should be given a significant role in the transition. She understands the business better than anyone realizes." Marcus's reaction was immediate and telling. "Dad, with all due respect, Elena is an assistant. She doesn't have an MBA, doesn't understand corporate finance or strategic planning. This sounds like the illness affecting your judgment," Richard pressed further. "I also want to establish a substantial scholarship fund, perhaps $500 million, for underprivileged students pursuing engineering degrees." $500 million? Marcus's voice rose despite his attempt at control. "Dad, that's nearly 20% of your net worth, the family legacy, the company's stability. I thought you'd support education initiatives," Richard replied softly. "Of course I support education, but this seems excessive. Maybe we should discuss smaller amounts, more reasonable allocations." Marcus's true priorities became crystal clear as he spent the next 20 minutes detailing why such generosity would be fiscally irresponsible. Sarah's visit that evening followed a similar pattern. When Richard mentioned wanting to donate his art collection to public museums rather than keeping it in the family, her perfectly composed facade cracked. "But Dad, that collection represents our heritage, our culture. Couldn't we at least keep some pieces? The Monet you bought for Mum's birthday, or the Picasso from your first $1 million deal?" Richard watched his daughter's eyes calculate the monetary value of memories that meant everything to him. "I want the art to inspire future generations, not sit in private homes." "I understand that sentiment," Sarah replied carefully. "But surely there's a middle ground. We could loan pieces to museums while maintaining ownership." Her compromise revealed her inability to conceive of true generosity. Everything had to benefit the family financially. Uncle Tom's reaction was the most predictable and disappointing. When Richard mentioned restructuring his will to emphasize charitable giving over family inheritance, Tom became openly hostile. "Richard, this is crazy talk. Family comes first. Your father built that construction company with his bare hands, and you've grown it into an empire. That belongs to Morrison blood, not strangers." "I thought you'd want to see the family name associated with positive change in the world," Richard responded. "The family name is associated with success, with achievement. Don't let guilt about having money drive you to give it all away to people who didn't earn it." Tom's words revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of wealth as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. But Eleanor's conversation, held the next morning, provided a stark contrast. When Richard mentioned his desire to fund scholarships and support educational initiatives, her eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Mr. Morrison, that's beautiful. Think of all the young people who could follow their dreams, who could become engineers or doctors or teachers because of your generosity. And what about you, Elena? What would you want for yourself?" She looked surprised by the question. "Me? Mr. Morrison, you've already given me more than I ever expected. Steady employment, good health insurance, the dignity of honest work. If anything happened to you, I just want to make sure Miguel finishes college. After that, maybe I could help other families navigate the challenges of single parenthood and education financing." Her response revealed someone who thought about lifting others rather than herself, who viewed his potential generosity as an opportunity to create positive change rather than personal wealth. That night, Richard sat in his study reviewing the day's conversations. The contrast couldn't have been starker. His own family viewed his charitable impulses as threats to their inheritance, while Elena saw them as opportunities to transform lives. But the real test was yet to come. Richard had one more card to play, one that would reveal whether anyone truly cared about his happiness and peace of mind during what they believed were his final months. He picked up his phone and made a call that would change everything. "Dr. Hendricks, it's time for the final phase. Tomorrow I want you to tell them I've decided to accelerate my timeline. Let's see who rushes to my bedside for love and who rushes there for money." The December morning arrived with the kind of brutal cold that makes Manhattan feel unforgiving. Richard Morrison lay in his king-sized bed, surrounded by medical equipment that Dr. Hendricks had strategically arranged to create the appearance of a man in his final days. The elaborate charade had reached its crescendo. "The deterioration has been rapid," Dr. Hendricks announced to the assembled family members in the penthouse living room. "I believe Richard has perhaps days, maybe a week at most. He's asked to see each of you privately to share his final thoughts." Richard watched through the partially open bedroom door as his family absorbed this news. Marcus immediately pulled out his phone, likely contacting his attorney. Sarah dabbed her eyes with a tissue while simultaneously checking her social media. Even grief had become a performance for her online followers. Tom paced near the windows, his agitation more about timing than sorrow. Elena stood apart from the family group, her hands clasped tightly, genuine tears streaming down her face. She had been at the penthouse since dawn, not because she'd been summoned, but because she couldn't bear the thought of Richard facing this alone. "I want to see Marcus first," Richard called out weakly from the bedroom. His eldest son entered with the solemnity of a man attending a business negotiation, disguised as a deathbed vigil. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed, his expression carefully composed. "Dad, I want you to know that I'll honor your legacy, grow the company, maintain the Morrison name in business circles," Marcus began, his words sounding rehearsed. Richard studied his son's face. "What if I told you I've decided to leave the majority of my wealth to charity, that I want to be remembered as someone who lifted others, rather than someone who accumulated assets?" Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment. "Dad, you're not thinking clearly. The medication, the stress, this isn't what you really want. You built this empire for your family, for your legacy. What if it is what I really want?" Richard pressed. "Then I'd have to consider whether you're mentally competent to make such decisions," Marcus replied, his true nature finally emerging. "I'd have a responsibility to protect you from making choices you'd regret." The threat was clear: oppose Marcus's interests, and he'd pursue legal action to override Richard's wishes. Richard felt his heart break a little more as he recognized the son he'd raised had become someone who valued money over relationships, control over compassion. Sarah's visit followed a similar pattern, though wrapped in more emotional manipulation. She brought photo albums filled with family memories, clearly hoping to trigger nostalgic guilt about abandoning the family legacy. "Remember this, Dad," she said, pointing to a picture from her college graduation. "You were so proud. You said you wanted your success to benefit future generations of Morrisons. I also said I wanted to make the world better for all children, not just my own," Richard replied. Sarah's smile became strained. "Of course, and we can do both. But surely family comes first. Surely your own blood deserves priority over strangers." Her words revealed the entitled worldview Richard had inadvertently fostered, that deserving had more to do with genetic lottery than character or need. Uncle Tom's visit was mercifully brief and predictably ugly. He made no pretense of grief or concern, launching immediately into accusations about Elena's manipulation and demands that Richard reconsider his charitable impulses. "You're being taken advantage of," Tom declared. "That assistant of yours has been poisoning your mind against your own family." "Elena has never asked me for anything beyond fair compensation for honest work," Richard responded. "That's what makes her dangerous," Tom shot back. "She's playing the long game, making herself indispensable while your real family gets pushed aside." The conversation devolved into Tom's angry predictions about family lawsuits and his threats to protect Richard from himself through legal intervention. But Elena's time at his bedside was entirely different. She entered quietly, carrying a cup of his favorite tea and a small wrapped package. "Miguel made this for you," she said softly, unwrapping a simple wooden picture frame containing a photo of Richard from the high school career day, surrounded by smiling students. "He wanted you to know that you inspired him to pursue engineering, that your visit changed his life." Richard felt genuine emotion welling up as he studied the photograph. In it, he saw himself genuinely happy, sharing knowledge rather than defending wealth, inspiring dreams rather than managing inheritance expectations. "Elena, if you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. "I'd want every child to have what Miguel has, a chance to dream big and the support to pursue those dreams. So I'd want every parent to have the security of knowing their love and hard work could be enough to give their children a better life." Her answer encompassed everything Richard had hoped to hear from his own family, a vision of using resources to create opportunity rather than simply preserve privilege. "And for yourself?" he pressed. "I have everything I need," she replied simply. "Meaningful work, a son I'm proud of, the respect of people I admire. What more could anyone ask for?" As Elena sat beside his bed, holding his hand in comfortable silence, Richard realized that Solomon's greatest wisdom wasn't in testing people's motives. It was in recognizing that true wealth lay not in what you accumulated, but in the relationships you built with people of genuine character. The test was nearly complete, but the hardest part lay ahead, revealing the truth and dealing with the consequences of what he'd learned about the people he loved. On a crisp December morning, exactly 6 weeks after his fabricated diagnosis, Richard Morrison made the decision that would forever alter his family dynamics. Dr. Hendricks arrived at the penthouse with a folder containing real medical test results showing Richard to be in excellent health for a man his age. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Dr. Hendricks asked, settling into the chair across from Richard's desk. "Once you reveal the truth, there's no going back. Your relationships with Marcus, Sarah, and Tom will never be the same." Richard looked out at the Manhattan skyline, where winter sunlight glinted off snow-covered buildings. "Solomon's wisdom teaches us that the truth, however painful, is preferable to living a lie. These past weeks have shown me who my family really is, and who they could become if they chose differently." That afternoon, Richard gathered everyone in his living room, appearing healthier than he had in weeks. Elena arrived with her usual punctuality, carrying a folder of correspondence, and wearing the quiet concern that had characterized her behavior throughout his supposed illness. "I have something important to tell all of you," Richard began, standing straighter than anyone had seen him in 6 weeks. "Something that will be difficult to hear but necessary for our family's future." Marcus leaned forward, his expression expectant. Sarah clutched her designer handbag, prepared for emotional news. Tom shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the coming revelation. Elena simply waited with her characteristic patience. "I am not dying," Richard announced clearly. "I have never been dying. The medical reports, the medications, the decline you've witnessed, all of it was a carefully orchestrated test." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard watched as shock, confusion, and then anger played across the faces of his family members. Elena's expression showed only relief and bewilderment. "What do you mean, a test?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. "You let us believe you were dying for 6 weeks. Do you have any idea what this put us through?" "Yes," Richard replied calmly. "I have a very clear idea of what it put you through. You immediately began planning how to divide my assets, questioned my mental competency when I suggested charitable giving, and threatened legal action to override my wishes." Sarah's perfectly composed facade cracked entirely. "This is insane, Dad. We were grieving, we were scared, we were trying to prepare for a world without you, and you were, what? Taking notes? Judging us?" "I was learning," Richard said simply. "Learning who would stand by a dying man's bedside out of love versus who would position themselves for inheritance. Learning who would support my wishes versus who would oppose them for personal gain." Tom exploded with rage. "This is sick, Richard. You've manipulated your own family, put us through hell for what? Some twisted psychological experiment?" "For truth," Richard replied. "For the same truth Solomon sought when he offered to cut a baby in half. The real mother was willing to give up her claim to save the child's life. She loved the baby more than she loved winning. I wanted to see who among you loved me more than you loved my money." Elena spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Morrison, I don't understand. Why did you include me in this? I'm not family, I'm not an heir." Richard turned to her with genuine warmth. "Because, Elena, you were the only person in this room who never asked about inheritance, never calculated your potential gain, never questioned my judgment when I spoke of charitable giving. When you thought I was dying, you brought me soup, researched treatments, and offered hope. When others brought business plans and legal documents, you brought peace lilies and prayers." The contrast was stark and undeniable. Marcus had prepared hostile takeover strategies. Sarah had scheduled meetings with estate planners. Tom had made promises using inheritance he hadn't yet received. Elena had simply offered love and support. "But what you don't understand," Richard continued, "is that this test revealed something else, something that changes everything." He walked to his desk and retrieved a leather-bound document. "This is my new will drafted during these past weeks. It reflects what I learned about character, about values, about who embodies the principles I want to see continue in the world." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "Dad, you can't be serious. After putting us through this charade, you're going to punish us for trying to protect the family's interests?" "I'm not punishing anyone," Richard replied. "I'm rewarding the values I believe in. Elena, you've shown me what it means to care about people rather than profit, to work with integrity, to think about lifting others rather than elevating yourself." Elena's eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Morrison, I don't want your money. I never asked for anything beyond fair employment." "Which is exactly why you deserve it," Richard said. "The new will establishes several key provisions. A $500 million education foundation, with Elena as the primary administrator, full college funding for Miguel and any future children Elena might have, and a trust that ensures Elena's financial security while employing her unique talents for social good." The room erupted in chaos. Marcus began shouting threats about legal challenges. Sarah dissolved into tears that seemed more about lost money than lost trust. Tom stormed toward the door, declaring the family destroyed, but Eleanor simply stared at Richard with tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "I would have done all of this, cared for you, supported you, hoped for your recovery, even if I knew I'd never inherit a penny. That's what you do for people you care about." And in that moment, Richard knew his test had been successful. He had found not just someone deserving of his wealth, but someone who understood that true riches lay in relationships, compassion, and the opportunity to make the world better for others. The revelation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the revelation, spring had returned to Manhattan, bringing with it a sense of renewal that perfectly matched the transformation in Richard Morrison's life. The Morrison Education Foundation occupied a gleaming new office space overlooking Central Park, where Elena Martinez, now officially titled as Executive Director, worked with a team of educators, counselors, and administrators to identify and support promising students from underprivileged backgrounds. Richard sat in his study, reviewing the Foundation's quarterly report with genuine pride. In just 6 months, they had awarded full scholarships to 127 students, established mentorship programs in 15 school districts, and created a network of support that extended far beyond financial assistance. Elena's vision of holistic education support, including tutoring, counseling, and career guidance, had proven more effective than traditional scholarship programs. The personal costs of his deception had been significant, but not entirely surprising. Marcus had indeed pursued legal action, challenging the will on grounds of mental incompetence and undue influence. However, Dr. Hendricks's testimony about Richard's clear mental state throughout the test, combined with detailed documentation of his decision-making process, had made the challenge unsuccessful. More painfully, Marcus had severed all personal contact with his father, taking a position with a competing firm and publicly criticizing Richard's betrayal of family values. Sarah had chosen a different path. After months of anger and hurt, she had gradually reconnected with Richard, though their relationship remained strained. She had surprised him by volunteering at the Foundation's mentorship program, working with teenage girls from backgrounds similar to her own privileged upbringing, but with vastly different opportunities. "I'm trying to understand what you saw in Eleanor," she had told him during one of their slowly healing conversations. "I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your daughter." Uncle Tom had remained predictably bitter, spreading gossip throughout their social circles about Richard's mental breakdown and Elena's manipulation. However, Tom's credibility had suffered when details emerged about his pre-inheritance spending sprees and false promises to creditors. The family's social circle had largely sided with Richard, recognizing the test's wisdom, even if they questioned its methods. But it was Elena's transformation that provided the most compelling vindication of Richard's choices. The single mother, who had quietly managed his correspondence and household, had evolved into a formidable advocate for educational equity. She had testified before congressional committees, spoken at education conferences, and built partnerships with universities across the country. Her background, understanding both the struggles of working families and the operations of significant wealth, made her uniquely effective at bridging different worlds. Miguel, now a sophomore at MIT studying engineering, had become the Foundation's first success story and most eloquent spokesperson. During the Foundation's inaugural fundraising gala, he had spoken about the difference between charity and opportunity. "Mr. Morrison didn't just give my mother and me money," Miguel had told the audience of potential donors. "He gave us the chance to dream bigger and the tools to make those dreams reality. But more importantly, he trusted my mother to help other families find the same opportunities. That trust has multiplied his generosity 100-fold. On this particular spring morning, Richard was preparing for a board meeting when Elena knocked on his study door. She entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and the quarterly financial report. "The auditors finished their review," she announced, settling into the chair across from his desk. "We're ahead of budget and ahead of projections for student success metrics. The board should be pleased." Richard accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how naturally Elena had grown into her leadership role. "Any regrets about leaving your quiet assistant position for all this responsibility?" Elena smiled, the same genuine warmth that had first caught his attention during the test. "Every morning, I wake up knowing that our work will change someone's life. Yesterday I got a letter from Maria Santos, remember her? The girl from Queens who wanted to study medicine but couldn't afford the MCAT prep course. She's starting medical school in the fall. And how is Miguel adjusting to having a famous mother? Richard asked with amusement. He's proud, but he keeps me humble. Last week he reminded me that all the recognition in the world doesn't matter if we lose sight of why we're doing this work. Elena paused, her expression growing more serious. Richard, I need to ask you something I've wondered about for months. Of course. Do you regret the test? The pain it caused your family, the relationships it damaged? Richard considered the question carefully, as he had many times over the past months. Solomon's judgment about the baby required him to threaten something precious, to reveal the truth. It caused pain, but it also prevented a greater injustice. My test caused pain, but it revealed character, both admirable and disappointing. Without that knowledge, my wealth might have been squandered on people who valued money over meaning. But Marcus is your son, Eleanor said gently. Sarah is your daughter. That has to hurt. It does, Richard admitted. But pretending they were people they weren't wouldn't have helped them grow. Sometimes love requires difficult truths. Sarah is slowly learning that lesson. Marcus may someday as well. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Miguel asked me something interesting last night. He wanted to know what I would do if I suddenly inherited billions of dollars. And what did you tell him? I told him I'd probably do exactly what we're doing now, but on a larger scale. Then he asked the better question, would I be corrupted by that much wealth? Would I become someone different? Richard leaned forward, intrigued. And your answer? I told him that wealth doesn't change who you are. It reveals who you are. You taught me that through your test. The question isn't whether money corrupts, but whether we have the character to handle responsibility wisely. Richard felt a deep satisfaction hearing his own hard-learned wisdom reflected back through Eleanor's understanding. And what did Miguel think of that answer? He said it made him want to focus on becoming the kind of person who could handle success responsibly, rather than just pursuing success itself. I think you'd be proud of how he's thinking about his future. Their conversation was interrupted by Richard's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled broadly. What is it? Eleanor asked, noting his expression. A message from Dr. Sarah Chen at Stanford Medical School. She's one of our scholarship recipients from the first group. Remember the young woman who wanted to develop affordable medical technology for rural communities? Eleanor nodded eagerly. Of course, the one who grew up on a farm in Nebraska and saw how difficult it was for her community to access quality health care. She's just been accepted into a joint MD-PhD program focusing on biomedical engineering. Her research proposal is for developing low-cost diagnostic equipment that can be manufactured and maintained in underserved areas. Richard set down his phone and looked at Elena with obvious pride. This is what legacy really means. Not buildings with your name on them, but brilliant minds given the chance to solve problems that matter. Elena's eyes shone with the same pride. Last month, I received a letter from the Foundation's 100th scholarship recipient. She wrote, "You didn't just change my life, you changed what I thought was possible for someone like me." That's the real return on investment. As they prepared for the board meeting, Richard reflected on how dramatically his understanding of wealth and family had evolved. The test had been painful but necessary, revealing that blood relationships meant nothing without shared values, while chosen family, like his relationship with Elena and Miguel, could provide the deepest satisfaction and most meaningful legacy. During the board meeting that afternoon, the directors reviewed impressive statistics. 89% of foundation recipients maintained GPAs above 3.5, 94% stayed enrolled in their programs, and early graduates were already beginning to give back through mentorship and small donations. But the numbers that mattered most to Richard were different. The letters from parents thanking the foundation for giving their children hope, the reports from teachers about increased motivation in entire school districts, the ripple effects of opportunity spreading through communities. As evening approached and the meeting concluded, Richard and Eleanor stood on the foundation office balcony, watching the sunset paint Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and amber. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," Eleanor said quietly. "Something I probably should have said months ago." Richard turned to her with curiosity. "The day you announced your fake diagnosis, I knew something wasn't quite right. Your symptoms didn't match what I'd researched about the condition Dr. Hendricks described. Your medications looked like vitamins, and you seemed alert in ways that contradicted the illness." Richard stared at her in amazement. "You knew?" And you never said anything? Elena smiled. I figured if you needed to test us, you probably had good reasons. And honestly, I was curious to see what your family would reveal about themselves. I just decided to be myself and let whatever was going to happen, happen. The revelation struck Richard with the force of a lightning bolt. Even during his elaborate test, Eleanor had demonstrated the very wisdom he was seeking, the ability to see through deception while responding with grace, the strength to remain authentic under pressure, the wisdom to trust in truth over manipulation. Why didn't you tell me you suspected? He asked. Because the test wasn't really about fooling anyone, Elena replied thoughtfully. It was about creating circumstances where people's true characters could emerge. Knowing it was a test wouldn't have changed how I treated someone I cared about who seemed to be suffering. As the last light faded from the sky, Richard realized that his test had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. He hadn't just found someone worthy of his wealth. He had discovered someone who understood the deeper principles that made wealth meaningful in the first place. Eleanor, he said quietly, I want you to know that when my time really does come, many years from now, I hope, you'll have the knowledge and resources to continue this work for generations. But more importantly, you'll have the wisdom to choose successors who share our values. Elena nodded solemnly. Miguel and I have talked about that responsibility. We understand that this isn't just about managing money. It's about stewarding values, about making sure opportunity keeps expanding rather than contracting. As they prepared to leave the office, Richard felt a profound sense of peace. Solomon's wisdom had taught him that the greatest test of character wasn't how people handled poverty, but how they handled abundance. His elaborate deception had revealed that true wealth lay not in accumulation, but in the relationships built with people of genuine character, and in the opportunity to use resources for purposes larger than oneself. The Morrison Education Foundation would continue long after Richard was gone, not because it bore his name, but because it embodied principles that Elena and Miguel would pass on to others who shared their vision of using privilege to expand opportunity rather than consolidate power. Walking out into the crisp Manhattan evening, Richard Morrison knew that his greatest legacy wasn't the business empire he'd built, but the values he'd identified, tested, and entrusted to people who would honor them. Solomon's wisdom had guided him to the truth that the measure of a life well lived wasn't what you accumulated, but what you enabled others to achieve. The test was complete. The real work of justice, generosity, and expanding opportunity would continue for generations to come. 5 years later, the Morrison Education Foundation had grown into one of the most respected educational non-profits in the country. Elena Martinez, now nationally recognized as an expert in educational equity, had been invited to advise the Department of Education on scholarship program design. Miguel Morrison Martinez, he had legally added Morrison to his name in honor of Richard's mentorship, had graduated summa cum laude from MIT and was beginning his PhD in sustainable engineering. Sarah Morrison had surprised everyone by becoming the foundation's most effective board member, using her social connections and event planning skills to raise millions in additional funding. She had also reconciled fully with her father, often saying that his test had forced her to examine her values and grow into someone she could respect. Marcus remained estranged from the family, though Richard continued to hope that time and reflection might eventually heal their relationship. In the meantime, Marcus's hostility had inadvertently validated Richard's decision. Someone who could hold a grudge for years over losing money they'd never earned was exactly the wrong person to entrust with philanthropic responsibility. Richard Morrison, now 72 and in excellent health, spent his days mentoring young entrepreneurs and serving as chairman emeritus of the foundation. His greatest joy came from watching Elena's vision expand and evolve, knowing that his wealth had found its way to someone who understood that true prosperity meant creating opportunities for others to thrive. The wisdom of Solomon lived on, not in ancient parables, but in the practical application of testing character, rewarding integrity, and using abundance to multiply justice rather than privilege. The test had ended, but the legacy would endure,